Okay, so to our in-person audience and to those of you watching us remotely, welcome. Welcome to Arizona State's Humanities Institute. We're thrilled to have you join us for what I'm calling our first event of the fall term, although our writing studio did already start. It's the first event in this room, so thank you all for coming out. The Humanities Institute is a vibrant space where ideas, cultures, and perspectives come together to explore the richness of the human experience. So whether you seek to engage with thought-provoking discussions, connect with a diverse community, or simply immerse yourself in the humanities, we hope you find today's event both inspiring and enriching. Here at the Humanities Institute, we believe in the power of dialogue and in the importance of examining the world through, as you can guess, a humanistic lens. So your presence here contributes to a dynamic environment where curiosity and collaboration thrive. We encourage you to participate, and there'll be plenty of opportunity for that, to ask questions and to share your insights. So you don't have to ask, you can also give. As we work together to deepen our understanding of the complex world we all live in. And so thanks again for being here and welcome to our community. We want to start with an apology regarding one of our presenters. Due to issues beyond her control, Professor Ayanna Thompson could not join us today, and we are working diligently to reschedule her appearance in the next iteration of what we hope will be a lively discussion. And I'll talk just a little bit about that. Today's event is actually part of a two-part series that examines cultural appropriation. So, just a quick little plug here. On September 16th, in this very room, at this very time, 4 to 5 o'clock, Professor Carlos Velez Ibanez and I, Curtis Austin, will present on this topic as it regards the African American and the Latinx community. Carlos is a Regents Professor in Anthropology and founding Director Emeritus of the School of Transborder Studies here at ASU. And so I don't think you want to miss that. He's a very fascinating human being and knows, I've presented with him a couple of times, he knows more than I can imagine knowing. So I hope you can come back on the 16th and hear him talk about cultural appropriation, which, if you didn't know, is the act of adopting elements of one culture by members of another culture, often without permission or understanding. This can involve using symbols, clothing, hairstyles, art, music, or practices from a marginalized culture by those in a more dominant or privileged group. While cultural exchange can be positive when done respectfully, appropriation often involves a power imbalance and can perpetuate stereotypes. It can disrespect cultural significance, and it can exploit the heritage of marginalized communities. It raises important discussions about respect, and hopefully we'll have some of that today, about representation and the boundaries between appreciation, which of course we want to do, and exploitation, which we don't want to do. So discussing cultural appropriation in a public university setting is valuable because it helps to foster our critical thinking, empathy, and awareness among people from diverse backgrounds. And as you all know, ASU serves as a melting pot of cultures and ideas, and examining cultural appropriation helps us to understand the complexities of identity, power dynamics, and privilege. It encourages dialogue about the difference between appreciation, again, and appropriation, helping us all to navigate the multicultural environment with sensitivity and I think more importantly with respect. What we want to do is not only to prepare our students but our faculty and staff well to engage thoughtfully in what is an increasingly globalized world. And so by exploring these topics, the Humanities Institute seeks to promote inclusivity and social justice, equipping us all to challenge the stereotypes we face, to address historical injustices, and to recognize the significance of cultural practices. Ultimately, these kinds of discussions, the ones that we're looking forward to having today, empower us as humans to become more informed and compassionate global citizens who can advocate for equity and respect across cultural boundaries. And so today, we welcome our special guest, Cristóbal Martínez, who will talk to us about his work with the group known as Post Commodity, which is an interdisciplinary art collective comprised of Martinez and Cadell Twist, who is Cherokee. Martinez is Inisado, Manito, and Chicano. Post-commodities art functions as a shared indigenous lens and voice to engage the assaultive manifestations of the global market and its supporting institutions, its public perceptions, its beliefs, and individual actions that comprise the ever-expanding multinational, multiracial, and multi-ethnic colonizing force that is defining the 21st century through ever-increasing velocities and complex forms of violence. In Post-Commodity, Martinez has exhibited his work both nationally and internationally, including in the 18th Biennale in Sydney, Australia, the Whitney Biennial in New York City in 2017, documented 14 in both Athens, Greece, and Kassel, Germany, and the 57th edition of the Carnegie International in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was also at Desert X in the Coachella Valley in California. And if we had more than 1 hour, I would still be here talking about the things he's done and the places he's been. I won't do that. So without further ado, please help us give a warm ASU welcome to Cristóbal Martínez.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. I want to thank the Humanities Institute for inviting me to speak on the topic of cultural appropriation. And what I'm going to present you with today is kind of thought piece supported by my art practice as an artist in the collective Post-Commodity. And when I think about this idea of cultural appropriation, I just go straight to appropriation, because it seems like appropriation for me, and like my standpoint and my research and my understanding, is that it's sort of pervasive, and it sort of cuts through all sectors of society. And so I want to share with you a little bit of some, just a very topical analysis of the word appropriation, and which will undoubtedly extend and complicate Curtis's and the Humanities Institute's definition. So let's have some fun. And so I'd like to start out by stating that I, like perhaps many of you here, have observed appropriation across a great many contexts throughout the world. And if you haven't seen the varying expressions that it takes throughout the globe, I'm sure that whether you realize it or not, you have certainly both seen and been a party to appropriation. And now, although appropriation is often considered extremely serious business, especially within the context of law, I find the word to contain irreconcilable dilemmas and cognitive dissonances that render it a highly unstable idea where power is almost always up for grabs. The very stability or lack thereof concerning appropriation is such that we use it in our daily lives to negotiate meaning, and always doing so in the presence of social goods, which are things that have a value assigned to them. We will often use appropriations to negotiate meaning along the continuum of collaboration and competition, and the outcomes of these activities will determine varying access to social goods, or in some cases, great disparities between the stakeholders involved, unless those who are negotiating are sophisticated enough to compromise with each other in ways where the outcomes of a given meaning are more equitably distributed. And this, I argue, is the reason why appropriation, or call it cultural appropriation, is always a political act. Now, but before I go any further, let's take a moment to even begin to consider what the hell I'm even talking about here by starting at the beginning with some etymology and a basic definition. Okay, so according to the New Oxford American Dictionary, preloaded on all Apple computers, the definition of appropriation is the action of taking something for one's own use, typically without the owner's permission, which aligns well with with your definition, as Curtis. And so this definition makes the word useful, for example, when we think about the colonization of all the Americas based on the appropriation of land by peoples not indigenous to the Western Hemisphere. But now the word appropriation itself is funny when we think about the related word misappropriation. When we make this familiar term strange, we can see that nearly all appropriation, according to the dictionary, is in fact misappropriation.
That's right.
In society, we are left with taking for granted the strangeness of this language, while also further complicating our own understandings, since our contemporary dictionary definition is ambiguous at best, because the word does not necessarily mean that something is taken without the owner's permission. This exists because we are still caught somewhere in time regarding the word's etymology. To illustrate this, the late Latin word appropriare simply means to make one's own. Furthermore, if we go to the later 14th century usage of appropriation, we get to the taking of something as private property. And what's interesting is that we go from the making of one's own to the taking for one's own. But again, I see us as stuck between making and taking in terms of our contemporary usage, and therefore justifying the functionality of the non-ambiguous misappropriation, which we use for the sake of clarity to emphasize wrongdoing when the word gets slippery. Despite how much I wish to have confused you, the word appropriation to me, an Genizarro from northern New Mexico, represents a deep opportunity for rascuache, hacking, and modification to express comedy or satire, irreverence, metaphors, love, and blessings. I hope you will understand with a few works of making and taking by the collective post-commodity, comprised of myself and artist Cade L. Twist. And so let's start at the top here. And what you're looking at is a piece called Facing the Wall. And this is near everything that I'm going to show you was part of an exhibition called Time Holds All the Answers. And it was curated by Gerald McMaster and held at or installed at Ramey Modern Museum in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And so this piece called Facing the Wall was installed in the museum's Picasso Gallery, which holds and houses the largest collection of Picasso prints in the world. And so the gallery space has been transformed by Post-Commodity, the artist collective whose exhibition was on view throughout Ramey Modern in 2021 and 2022. And for this work, Post-Commodity did not create any of the individual objects in the space. However, their gesture of turning Picasso's works around to face the wall is an art intervention. And by turning or interrupting the presentation of Euro-North American art history, Post-Commodity aims to symbolically shift the museum context. And in this pause, Post-Commodity neutralizes an icon of the Western art market and canon in order to create the conditions at Ramey Modern Museum that are better suited to host the collective's indigenous voice. Now, this Picasso exhibition, titled A Formative Encounter, was conceived to bring focus to the oceanic and African artworks in the museum's collection and emphasize how much Picasso and other modernist artists owed to the artists who made them. And the fact remains, however, that the exhibition is presented in the Picasso Gallery And it was the mechanisms of colonialism that brought cultural objects from distant cultures to a museum in Saskatoon. With the works of Picasso facing the wall, the sculptures created by indigenous artists from Papua New Guinea and West Africa are given their due prominence. They are presented as autonomous works of art rather than in relation to the European master. Now this work, Kinapikoias, was a title provided by curator Gerald McMaster, and it's a Cree word. It means snake meat. And this work is composed of debris booms used to catch and hold environmental contaminants such as garbage, oil, and chemicals. And the colors of the booms correspond to different types of threats: red, flammable; yellow, radioactive; blue, dangerous; and white, poisonous. The labeling system for hazardous materials, otherwise known as hazmat. And to indigenous peoples, these are shared medicine colors that carry knowledge, purpose, and meaning throughout the Western Hemisphere. And suspended like hung meat, the booms represent a snake that has been chopped into 4 parts. Each part represents an area of the colonial map of the Western Hemisphere: South America, Central America, North America, and all of the surrounding islands. The title, Kinapikoias, is a Plains Cree word, again, meaning snake meat. Divided by borders, post-commodity assert that all people living in the Americas are riding on the back of this snake. Acknowledging this divided state, post-commodity calls for border-crossing discourses led by indigenous peoples throughout the Americas about land, resources, and shared knowledge. Now, this image here is an image of a Greek statue of Doryphorus. Doryphorus is a warrior. And Doryphorus, at the time of post-commodities work, lived or was on exhibition permanently in the rotunda of the Minneapolis Institute of Art. After a few years of conversation and negotiation, post-commodity had the statue removed, and it's in its place replaced with a 2,200-gallon polyethylene hazmat chemical storage container. This piece is titled "Let Us Pray for the Water Between Us." And you're looking at this hazmat chemical storage container, but in addition to that, embedded within the bowels of the container is a brushless linear motor, leather mallet, wood still, aircraft cable, and algorithmic composition. This was commissioned by the Minneapolis Institute of Art. Let Us Pray for the Water Between Us is a site-specific installation responding to the forced displacement of indigenous communities and the complexity of human relationships bound by shared sources of water that are increasingly difficult to protect and preserve from waste and contamination. For this imposing work, Post-Commodity transforms a 2,200-gallon chemical storage tank, primarily used for industrial farming, into a self-playing, percussive, and resonant instrument. The collective modifies a venerated place designed to secure cultural objects representing the Western Judeo-Christian scientific worldview by removing the resident Greek sculpture Doryphorus and additional artifacts, by altering the purpose of the rotunda. Post-Commodity has prepared a new contemporary context better suited, again, to its indigenous voice. The shifted rotunda presents a symbolic appending of the white European foundations of the museum and seeks to forcibly dismantle the institutional structures that have excluded or objectified indigenous peoples and their cultures. Let us pray for the water between us acknowledges and honors through living, breathing sound the role of indigenous tribes as important stewards of water, air, and land in Minnesota and throughout the Americas. It is a prayer for greater respect, accountability, and transparency among state and federal governments and corporations to tribal governments and communities around the appropriate management of our shared natural resources. For this work, post-commodity transforms a chemical storage tank, typically used for industrial farming, into a self-playing and highly resonant instrument. And through sound, it acknowledges and honors the role of indigenous peoples, stewards of the water, air, and land throughout the Americas. Overlooking the South, this work was then moved and it migrated up north into Canada, into Saskatoon, and it overlooked the South Saskatchewan River. And within the context of Minnesota, within the context of Saskatchewan and Saskatoon, and throughout all of the Americas, it is a prayer for greater respect, accountability, and transparency among state, provincial, territorial, and federal governments and corporations to indigenous nations and communities, again, around the appropriate management of our shared natural resources. And so one of the things that's really beautiful about this work, if you think about appropriation, and appropriation of the museum to tell a story, is that if you think about a rotunda and you apply museum as body metaphor, the rotunda would then serve as the chest cavity of the body. And what do we find within the chest cavity? We find the heart, we find the lungs. And what happens here is that this drum with a robot inside, it strikes a beat, and then a certain number of time passes, and then it strikes another beat, but it's added 20 milliseconds to that time. And every time it adds 20 milliseconds, each beat. So you can imagine the beat is expanding. And so over time, you end up with about 8 seconds between beats, and then it starts to, as a palindrome, it starts to compress back down to 4 seconds. So you have 4 seconds to 8 seconds. So you have a beat, which is the heart, but then you have the expansion and contraction of the beat, representing the lungs, and the idea of water, and water is our life. And so trying to create a space where people can embody that meaning of the often taken for granted water that we enjoy every day. Okay. So this next work is also a water piece. This one's titled Going to Water, and it is a multi-channel video and sound installation. And Going to Water depicts the Owens Valley, located east of the Sierra Mountains in California. And indigenous peoples have long converged in the area to trade and socialize. The nearby Paiute tribes of Bishop and Lone Pine call the valley a place of flowing water. And in the early 1900s, the city of Los Angeles constructed an aqueduct to divert water from the valley, carrying it over 300 kilometers south to support the city's growing population. And this caused Owens Lake to go dry by 1926, devastating the valley's ecosystem. And the empty lake bed creates large dust storms that carry toxic, cancer-causing particles for miles. And communities in the valley have been heavily impacted by adverse health effects caused by the lake bed dust, the loss of viable farmland, and ongoing displacement. As Environmental Policy and Action, a government agency, currently operates 22 cameras throughout the valley to monitor the environmental conditions. And for Going to Water, Post-Commodity gathered footage from the online archive of these recordings, projected onto 3 large screens with an expansive and haunting soundtrack. The work creates a tension between the scenic beauty of the valley and the horror of ecological disaster, it also puts you in the control room. And everything that we do in post-commodity is self-implicating, and it also implicates all audiences to the work. So everyone becomes part of the ceremony, if you will, of appropriation. And let's just think about it for a little bit, the appropriation. Where are all these expressions of appropriation happening? And they're happening at multiple levels within, these are systems of appropriation. We're talking about an appropriation of water. Appropriation of water taken from the Paiute. Well, at the same time, post-commodities appropriation of the videos meant to survey the land in the absence of water. And then now the reappropriation of yet more water to run the sprinkler system that they use in order to mitigate the dust in the valley. So they actually water the dry land like a golf course in order to mitigate the carcinogens, the sort of airborne carcinogenic PM10 that lifts into the air. This is a very windy valley. I guess we don't really have sound connected to this, but I'll just turn it up to, can you hear it? Mm-hmm. Oh, great. Oh, excellent. I'll show a couple more pieces so that we can open it up to conversation. Does that sound good? Yes. Okay. All right. I want to show you this piece, which is located in the Coachella Valley, and this is the iconic Miles C. Bates house. And it's a mid-century modern home that was being restored. This must have been like around 2018. 2019, and Post-Commodity did a piece called "It Exists in Many Forms," and it's using the innovative wave roof line of this particular house as an acoustic resonator. And it's a land artwork that interrogates the meaning of stewardship in the context of mid-century modern enthusiasm and the restoration of homes like the Wave House, a symphonic iconography of site-specific anxieties, obscures a system of irrational discourses disciplined and tuned for market speculation. And in the desert, restoration of an iconic mid-century modern home represents the nostalgic persistence of atomic age idealisms from which the contemporary veneration of mid-century modernism has emerged. And the window as portal for natural light and exterior views vis-a-vis landscape painting creates a state of tacit awe for dwellers and collectors of mid-century modern homes. And the positioning of homes as artistic fetish emerges out of historic tract home production for articulating an economy of scale for massive, previously unimaginable suburban development within desert climates with limited resources to support human life. At this site of human complexity and the simplicity of clean lines, it exists in many forms as a meditation on the worldview, noise harmonies, and methodology of stewardship that has prized the anesthetization of land for maximum yield per square plot development. So for this, we positioned a bunch of construction site boomboxes and performed this art ethnography where we got to meet with homeowners of these mid-century modern homes, real estate agents and scholars of architecture, all sort of rallying around this market in Palm Springs, this mid-century modern home market where we're seeing these homes skyrocket in the tens of millions of dollars. And got to hear what their anxieties were about. And one of their major anxieties was in fact the local tribe, not too far away. And so this is another example of a home in the area. This is what is referred to by the enthusiasts as a Wexler, like the way you might say it's a Picasso. This is a Wexler. And for this work, we created an additional piece called Truck Hunting near Agua Caliente Reservation. And it's the framing of what's called a butterfly roof line, and recalling the roof line that was designed in 1954 by architect Donald Wexler for a mid-century modern home, the one that I just showed you. And for us, it's a symbol of the progressive design movement that helped shape urban development in California's Coachella Valley. It's sleek, white modernist homes dot the landscape, which has been divided into gridded plots, unfortunately, for the indigenous peoples of that area, and defying the sustaining capacity of natural ecologies throughout the Americas. These modular prototypes, again, were created out of an atomic age optimism. Proud of our kill, we display our trophy. And then the last one, South by North is also North by South. This work reflects a shared indigenous structures throughout the Americas. A lot of people think that pyramids only existed in what is referred to as Mesoamerica. We had pyramids all over this hemisphere, from north going all the way to south. And these pyramids and mounds, we see these common forms as an expression of the migration of knowledge by indigenous peoples of the Americas. And post-commodities pyramid is composed of barrels used to contain hazardous materials, such as nuclear waste. This stack formation is similar to how such barrels are commonly stored in warehouses or below ground. And throughout the Americas, indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted by resource extraction and material storage, which often take place on or in close proximity to indigenous territories. This is especially the case when we're talking about nuclear material, uranium mining, the barrels and refinement as well. And the barrels in post-commodities pyramid are painted according to the hazardous material labeling system, which I cited earlier. And these colors correspond again to indigenous medicine colors, but we have the dual meaning, the hazmat meaning, the medicine meaning, one harmful, one healing. They act as a complex and conflicting metaphor for the Americas. And we've arranged the barrels in a pattern that references designs found in indigenous beadwork and textiles throughout the Western Hemisphere. And the pyramid extends beyond the boundaries of the gallery. The pyramid extends beyond the boundaries of the gallery, demonstrating the failure of containment. All right, thank you. Thank you so much. I know that was a lot. Thank you. All
Yes,
right.
thank you. That was very, very, very interesting. We're going to get the dialogue started here really quickly, but I would want to go back to the top of your talk, the beginning where you were talking about etymology, before we get to questions about the images, and ask if you can expound on the similarities and differences of the making and the taking portion of your definition. Like that struck me as something very interesting, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it would be bad news if I, as an artist, came here to take a side on appropriation. The justice studies concern with appropriation is important. It's important to justice. It's important to civil society. It's part of what makes a society a civil society. Like, you can't have a civilization without questioning the ethics of appropriation. But artists are like one of the few people in society that have been given permission, and it's like an unspoken permission, to appropriate. That's what we do for a living. Every work of art is in relationship to its history, to a history, and histories of art, histories of creativity, and histories of making. And so for me, it's really important to show the conflicts, the collaborations, and the comedy of the situation is, I think, maybe something you might not get from other scholars on the matter of appropriation. So I felt like that's how I could like hole up on some of the potential knowledge gaps that could exist in the conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's very helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you indulging me on that. And with that, we would like to open the floor to questions, comments, and feedback for our presenter. Anyone?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. I have an immense sense of guilt because I booked a trip to Palm Springs just to go see the mid-century modern. This is true.
Wonderful.
But you open up.
It's wonderful.
I know. You open up
so
an
happy.
entire new world, and now I have to book a second trip.
Yeah.
But my question actually was about the sound in that piece with the roof. Actually, no. I mean, I hear this sound that seems to me very distinctive, but I don't know where it's coming from. Maybe you can talk about what is the sound coming from, and what is the meaning?
Yeah, great.
Or the appropriation.
It's simple. I mean, what we did with the boom boxes and the ethnography that we did was really situated around like what are the intentions behind mid-century modern enthusiasm. Our hypothesis were that they were market-driven at best, that the commodification of these tract homes would be like one of the major drivers of enthusiasm, And what we found was there is a lot of investment in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars to preserve these tract homes, and in doing so, you find that whenever people place a lot of investment into something, they want to build security around it. And so they talked a lot about the ways in which they felt insecure about investing in this, what we had, as post-commodity, has built as a fetish, an aesthetic fetish. And they were basic things that you would come to expect, like earthquakes. The winds are particularly powerful in the Coachella Valley, so the weather, even other carcinogens like the nearby Salton Sea, which has similar issues, Owens Valley. But then it was also too, maybe not surprising to us, but the tribes who are local to the region, because the city is got checkerboarded. And so you have the tribal lands, the nation lands, interwoven with private land. And sometimes these homes, in one case, one of these homes ended up on tribal land. And when people couldn't control the future of that home, they developed rhetorics and positions driven by paranoia and fear and what would, in my opinion, constitute a lack of respect just based on the prevailing ignorance about the people, the indigenous people of that region. And those things were striking. So there's native flute playing there. There's wind playing in there. There's earthquakes. There's heavy machinery. There's all of these anxieties have an iconography. And we place those iconographies into that space. And then we bounce them off the waveline roof and created a kind of hyper-directionality of sound that allowed you to, as you're sort of exploring the interior of the house in restoration, you're sort of also exploring the anxieties.
Thank you.
You bet. Yes?
Hi, I'm interested in how you create a space where self-implication is successful. With the mid-century example, I can see where that kind of works with the sound and stuff, but what about in a museum where people just kind of randomly go sometimes on a day trip or schools visiting?
I think I'll give you an example of self-implication. A lot of times when post-commodity makes work, it doesn't make work with the premise that we are not involved in the system. We are the systematicity of metaphors, we are positioning. So every time we make a work, we're positioning metaphors, and the purpose of those metaphors is to try to understand something in terms of something else. Those things that we're trying to understand are not things that we see ourselves as clean or outside of, but they're things that we see ourselves as part of. So for example, when you think about the chemical storage tank in the rotunda, and we talk about this, this call to prayer, this blessing, this hope that we would become better stewards of water, we take into account that in our individual lives, we are also implicated in the pollution of this water by the food we eat, by the cars we drive, by the things we do in our daily lives. Bring us into relationship with the issue. A lot of times what we're seeing in art, which is very difficult for me, is the artist pointing the finger. The artist doesn't bring themselves into the story. The artist is oftentimes virtuous, righteous, above the problem, not in the problem. And the artist is to be in the problem from our perspective, because you can't have respect or reciprocity or enter into relationships or take responsibility if you're only showing the problem as if you're outside of it. And I see that happening a lot with scholarship. It's fierce and madly problematic. And I see it happening in art. So when are we ourselves going to begin to disrupt the very hegemonies that we're implicated and guilty in having created ourselves in pursuit of justice? I see us much more better off getting along and finding a way, fighting hard to find a way to get along, but to do so in a manner that where there is a level of honesty, there is a level of being amenable to self-transformation, that there is a place where we can get, where we can begin to have conversations with one another without trying to weaponize fragility. And so that's what I hope for, and that's what I hope our art helps to. I hope it's like a pressure release valve, that it helps to release some of it, and that it models some of this. It's complicated. It's got a very strong edge to it that's pushing in a particular direction. While at the same time, there are a lot of works that are about trying to mitigate us versus them. So there's a lot of contradictions happening. There's a lot of this work sort of feeding into itself and cannibalizing itself. And if you look really hard, you'll see all this sort of vexing nature of some of these issues. And so that's where the comedy comes in. The sense of humor comes in. It's very dark sense of humor, but it's also done within the framework of who we are, which as an indigenous group, we're metalheads. We like to tell stories. We enjoy myths, and we enjoy things that we enjoy poking and prodding at the narrative incongruencies and cognitive dissonances that we all together create and maintain in the world. And our art is very much about doing that, just to try to get us to see outside of the binary, bipartisan structures that we're so disciplined and consumed by, at least in our world here in the North America. Yes.
Thank you. The point you made about artists, that a big part of what artists do is appropriate, and that is sort of embedded in Candy Wiley. I mean,
absolutely.
Just as an example.
Uh-huh.
It seems to me that part of what you're getting at is that there's an always sort of coterminous process that's
Yes.
happening. You know?
Yes.
The idea of appropriation is sort of built around these sort of dichotomies that like there's ownership, there's organic, and there's
Right.
ownership and taking it inorganic. And while there's power relations, and we should, you know, when you talked about the checkerboard, they're all operating together. And this is the thing about appropriation. Appropriation needs that thing which is assumed to be theirs to exist in itself.
Right.
It's always working that way.
Right.
And this has always struck me as really, you know, kind of a bit simple-minded. And a bit, you know, problematic. You know, if they're the problem, if that's the problem, the there and the that, the person speaking is predicated upon that, and there's no them without that. And,
Right.
And they're always
Right.
operating in relation. So
That's right.
not necessarily a question, but it just seems that you're. I really appreciate, you know, as somebody who does museum work and interested in arts, I just appreciate the perspective you take as an artist to come at this question of appropriation.
Yeah, I think like your summation, your analysis is the moment of jest. That's what makes the whole thing hilarious. But you have to be open. You have to have a sense of humor, right? Look at how difficult all of the subject matter is. But yet we still have to have a sense of humor because we still have an obligation to our ancestors to tell the story of our time. And part of telling the story of our time is trying to get to a place where we can be more human, not regulated by one another, but in the sense more human, in a sense more hilarious, in a sense more contradictory, in a sense more complex, and maybe perhaps less certain.
Yeah.
And so we definitely feel comfortable within a space of great uncertainty. That's one of the things that we've built as post-commodity, is a capacity to sit within uncertainty and play in that space. To be able to come back from that space to tell a story, to share a story that will otherwise probably in many cases be quite unpopular with everybody.
Yeah, yeah.
Everybody.
Because people want to have you know, this is the thing, people want to have a side.
Of course.
And the sense in which people, you know, everybody's going to believe their side, but having your side is dependent on someone having another. And so it's more of a dance
Right.
than an opposition.
How might we appropriate our own reptilian minds so that we may have the opportunity to short circuit those instincts, to make ourselves new, to see each other as new again? That's a big question. I think we can do that with art. But artists, it requires mad courage to do that. Like you gotta be willing to really go there. And that takes a lot of time to build and a lot of energy, and it's something that is very, very challenging for our students. And it's an ongoing challenge for me and my collaborator and our contemporaries, but I feel like this is the project. It's like what gets me up in the morning. Yeah. Right.
Okay, we're going to go across and in the back here. So here, and here.
So I'm curious about the medicine colors and toxic
Yeah.
waste
Yeah.
colors, and that feels like an especially ambivalent sign in those two works that included that. And I'm curious.
Yeah,
I'm
you know.
curious if people were offended by that, or if you got pushback from
I typically find that people don't respond as offended, but they do walk away oftentimes decentered. And we are oftentimes, and that's the work, that's part of the work. But we're not doing anything other than pointing to facts. It's a fact that these colors are hazmat colors, just as much as it's a fact that they're indigenous medicine colors. The reality of us bringing two discourses, a discourse of toxicity and a discourse of medicine, is not only like the work of post-commodity here, but I mean, it happens in medicine. Like, let's think about chemotherapy for a moment and what chemotherapy is up to as a treatment. And you might find that this is very much a metaphor that cancer survivors might relate to, in the sense that they have to take literally into their bodies the seemingly divergent discourse. One is, think it's going to make you sick, and then it's going to heal you at the same time. And so, but what's important to us is that we bring the divergent discourses together and bring them into close proximity, because it puts us in a position to have to start to deal with things that we might otherwise ignore, because we're not willing to face the discomfort that comes with even being able to recognize how irreconcilable in some cases this is. And to be able to think about how this seemingly vexed situation might lead to the reasons why we struggle so much. But yet at the same time, it doesn't change the fact that they're so close to one another. They're interrelated with one another. They share a destiny with one another. They represent a relationship to one another. And so these things are like, require a generous read. They're seemingly divergent, yet at the same time, they're not mutually exclusive to one another.
Excellent. David?
Thank you so much for this, provocative presentation. I want to ask a question that maybe gets a little more directly at some things you've been dancing around, but you have students who I'm sure come in and they're kind of almost paralyzed about cultural appropriation, and people under a certain age, especially, I find, are just hyper aware of not wanting to step on somebody else's toes, right? And you're presenting a much messier approach than a really super cautious approach that I'm sure students like that might be envisioning. So I'm just wondering, can you say something more about what you would tell students in that position? What kind of a guidance do you give them?
So I would say that there is a lot of noise in this work, and a projection of noise, an amplification of noise. But it is very, very measured. And it is very, very carefully composed. Not by any, it's meant to look like the heavy metal guitarist who seems maniacally wild, but yet that isn't at all, is actually in a very relaxed state, performing some rather technical music And I think that that would be a good analogy to what our aspirations are here in post-commodity. I just tell my students the truth. Art isn't a place one goes to for safety. It is, the artists are some of the most powerful influencers and mediators of meaning in the world. They are determiners of reality, both repelled by institutions, governments, and corporations, as much as coveted. And so students have to, from my perspective, it is important in education that students understand the capacity of art, going back to ethical issues, so that they have the intellectual literacies capacities, critical thinking capacities to understand whether or not they're being disciplined toward propaganda. Mm-hmm. So it's very important that students know the underlying linguistic, visual literacies, humanities, cultural properties, scientific properties, whether that's within a Western framework or an indigenous framework or any myriad of frameworks, to know, what it is that they are playing around with. And so I think that's my approach, is to make sure that students have the opportunity to think out loud, and that they know that they can revise, that they know that they can make mistakes, because failure is the site. It's the site for innovation, the site for learning. And that through those mistakes and failures, that they always have the opportunity to revise, and that we create the condition within the classroom of students seeing themselves as part of a public, and that this is a public that is tooled as a learning community with the ability to be patient, with the ability to be thoughtful, generous with one another, and tolerant of one another, so that these mistakes can come to pass over a period of time. And so I try to create the conditions by which people can be artists in my classroom.
Thank you. We have just one more question, unless there's something from our online audience. We'll have your question, and we'll just encourage you to join us in a post-conversation. The filming will stop, but we'll still be here, and there's snacks and food that you can enjoy. And if you don't have time to stay, please take some with you. But we'll take this question, and unless there's another one, we'll let that be the last one.
So I like the fact that, beautiful presentation. I like the fact that you mentioned that appropriation, is so pervasive, and I think that social media today has actually intensified that. Now, my question is, your point that artists appropriate a lot. I'm looking at the ethical issues involved. So artists have kind of the right to appropriate. Now, when they come out with their act, they kind of copyrighted those acts. They copyright them. And so it kind of raises an ethical issue, such that today on social media, when somebody is posting something and he had to use somebody's act, maybe music at the background, he had to make sure that he acknowledges that this is not mine, it is somebody's. Meanwhile, the artist who is appropriating is not a kind of accountable to anybody. He appropriates the art, and it kind of let me say, plagiarizes that act, transforms it with the hope of dealing with a societal problem, maybe dealing with an ancestral issue, and that gives him the right to do what he's doing. But my problem is, why would the artist now copyright that very act that he himself has appropriated?
Yeah, it's wonderful. This kind of contradiction, it represents an example of the kind of cognitive dissonance and narrative incongruencies that pervade society that I positively enjoy as an artist. Right? And that's where I deliberately go, like moth to the flame, every single time. But it's you choose your work, right, carefully. With this short life that we have, and so mine tends to be within indigenous frameworks, or through an indigenous lens, having a lot to do with land. But I find the situation also extremely farcical, and it's there's a tension within art as a broader concept, where some art is more, first of all, art, when we think about fine art, my collaborator, Cade L. Twist, has shared with me that curator, Hamza Walker, who is a curator of Lax Art in Los Angeles, and is a new, there's a new name for the gallery. I can't recall it right now, but he says that art is an unregulated industry. And so you've got like this aspect of art, which is fine art, which is an unregulated industry, which creates a lot of these strange things. You know, there's an appropriation, and then and there's an irreverence to intellectual property in some cases, and while at the same time pandering to the IP laws, and these things can happen in an unregulated industry, and that's part of what makes art a place for thinking, because you can't come about new strategies and new ideas without comedy and without noise and without confusion. Like, these things can create the conditions for curiosity that can lead to new ideas and new solutions. But I think it gets amplified because in art, in terms of a broader economic structure, you have some things that are more industrialized and more commercialized than other things. And like, for example, when you think about this work that I'm showing you, coming from a collective called Post Commodity, you could start to see it's large in scale, it's oftentimes very ephemeral. It starts to play with the marketability of the object. It goes into a tradition of dematerializing the object that's already been with art for quite some time now. But the idea that some art like ours, which is somewhere along the continuum of creating schisms in a market versus a music industry where they're trying to sell X number of units on iTunes, you end up with a really complex set of IP issues that cut across all manner of creativity. And I think it does create this sort of black hole, that is sort of self-consuming. And so we get this really weird tautology that you're talking about.
Well, thank you very much. Quite edifying.
This was fun.
It's
Thank
quite a
you.
bit of fun.
Thanks for
and-
all the questions.
I
They're
think it
amazing.
brings us full circle to the making and taking piece. That last question, you take a little, then you make something, and now you got the copyright. So we really appreciate you're big here and helping us think through some of these things. Can we give Professor Martinez?
Thanks, everyone. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.